June 26, 1943. Late afternoon over occupied France near Forleo, Lieutenant Robert Johnson sat in the cockpit of his P-47 Thunderbolt, watching a flight of B-17 bombers turn for home after bombing Villa-Coublay airfield near Paris. Johnson was 23 years old. He'd been in combat for 2 months. One confirmed kill to his name scored 13 days earlier over the Netherlands. Today he was about to discover whether the airplane beneath him, an aircraft that many questioned, could actually keep him alive when pushed beyond all reasonable limits. The P-47 Thunderbolt was the largest single-engine fighter ever built by any nation. 10,000 pounds empty, 17,500 lb fully loaded. Powered by a massive 2,000 horsepower Pratt & Whitney R2 800 double Wasp radial engine armed with 850 caliber Browning machine guns. Fast in a straight line, deadly at high altitude. Absolutely brutal in a dive. But the P-47 had one significant problem that was costing American pilots their lives. It couldn't turn with German fighters. The Fowler-Wolf 190 and Messed Bf 109 were lighter, more agile. They could execute tight horizontal turns that the massive Thunderbolt simply couldn't match. In a sustained turning fight at medium altitude, the P-47 was at a disadvantage against experienced German pilots. That disadvantage could be fatal. American doctrine said Thunderbolt pilots should never turn with German fighters. Never. Try to outmaneuver them, use speed, use altitude, dive in, shoot, climb out, hit, and run. Don't get caught in a turning fight. Johnson had tried following that doctrine since his first combat mission on April 18, 1943. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't. The German pilots were experienced. They understood how to bait American pilots into unfavorable positions. They knew the Thunderbolt's weaknesses. The 8th Air Force had been losing P-47 pilots since the aircraft entered combat in March. The learning curve was steep. The cost was measured in young lives. Johnson had watched pilots die. Good men, they climbed into their Thunderbolts believing in their training and came back in boxes or didn't come back at all. The official reports often said pilot error. The instructors said these pilots weren't following doctrine properly, but the pilots who survived knew the truth. Combat was messier than doctrine. The enemy didn't cooperate with American tactical plans. Sometimes you got caught in a turning fight, whether you wanted one or not. At 19,000 FT, 48 P-47s from the 56th Fighter Group were spread across the sky in loose formation, providing top cover for the returning bombers. Johnson was flying tail end Charlie, the last position in his squadron's formation. The most vulnerable spot, the position newer pilots often got assigned. He scanned the sky above and behind, looking for the dark specks that meant German fighters diving from altitude. The afternoon sun was low in the west, hard to see, perfect ambush position. Then he saw them. 16 Fowler-Wolf 190s from the second group of fighter Wing 26 diving from 25,000 ft, coming from the Sunday. Coming fast. Johnson keyed his radio, tried to warn his flight leader before he could complete the transmission. The first, a Wolf, opened fire. 20 cannon shells ripped through Johnson's P-47. The canopy shattered. Glass and plexiglass fragments filled the cockpit. Hydraulic fluid sprayed across his face, burning his eyes. A 7.92 machine gun bullet nicked his nose, destroyed his oxygen mask. Another bullet hit his right leg, the round splitting in half as it entered just under the skin. Fire erupted in the cockpit. The P-47 snapped into an AT- of inverted spin. Johnson couldn't see through the hydraulic fluid, couldn't breathe without his oxygen mask at 19,000 ft, couldn't control the aircraft with the hydraulic system destroyed. The massive fighter tumbled through the sky like a brick thrown from a building. He tried to bail out, wedged his feet against the cockpit frame and pulled on the canopy. With both hands, the canopy wouldn't budge. The hydraulic system that normally slid it back was completely destroyed. He was trapped in a burning, spinning fighter with no way out. The fire in the cockpit burned hotter. Metal groaned under stress. The engine screamed at overspeed. Johnson thought about his wife Barbara back in the United States. He resigned himself to death. He stopped fighting, waited for impact. Then somehow the fire went out. Starved of oxygen at high speed in the spin, it simply extinguished itself. Johnson kicked left rudder, pulled back on the stick. The P-47's nose came up. The spin stopped. He was flying level at 8,000 ft, half blind from hydraulic fluid bleeding from his nose and leg with no hydraulic pressure, no oxygen, and no way to know how badly damaged his aircraft actually was. He pointed the battered fighter toward England and shoved the throttle forward. The Pratt & Whitney engine, despite everything, was still running, still producing power. That's when he saw a Wolf pull up alongside him. The German pilot flew formation on Johnson's left wing, close enough that Johnson could see him clearly through his oil-smeared canopy. The German looked at the shredded American fighter, looked at Johnson. The German pilot appeared. Surprised the Thunderbolt was still flying. Then the German positioned himself behind Johnson and opened fire. Again, hundreds of 7.92 machine gun bullets hammered into Johnson's P-47. The German had expended his 20 cannon ammunition on the initial attack. All two he had left were the two cowl-mounted machine guns, but at close range, even machine guns were deadly. Johnson hunched behind his armored seatback, the only protection he had left. The noise was unbearable. Metal screaming, bullets punching through aluminum. The smell of cordite and burning oil filled the cockpit. He could hear rounds hitting all around him, hitting the wings, the fuselage, the tail. The German pilot flew alongside again, looked at Johnson, shook his head as if in disbelief, then lined up for another pass. This time the German used a technique called spraying. He worked his rudder back and forth while firing, walking his bullets from wing tip to wing tip across Johnson's aircraft. It was a method designed to ensure hits on every vital system. Nothing should survive this kind of concentrated fire. Johnson's P-47 shuddered under the onslaught. More holes appeared in the wings, in the fuselage, in the tail section. The aircraft should have come apart. Any normal fighter would have disintegrated under this punishment. Should have fallen from the sky in pieces. It kept flying. The German made 3 more passes. Each time he emptied his guns into the Thunderbolt. Each time Johnson expected the wing to fold, or the tail to separate, or the engine to quit, or a fuel tank to explode. The P-47 absorbed the punishment and continued toward England. The big Pratt & Whitney radial engine kept running. The wings stayed attached. The control surfaces still responded to Johnson's inputs even without hydraulics. Finally, after the 5th attack run, the German ran out of ammunition. He pulled up alongside Johnson one last time, rocked his wings. A gesture of respect from one pilot to another, an acknowledgement of the Thunderbolt's incredible toughness and Johnson's courage. Then he turned back toward France. Johnson nursed the crippled P-47 across the English Channel. He had no landing gear hydraulics, no flaps, no radio. The vision was still blurred from hydraulic fluid in his eyes. His leg was bleeding through his flight suit. His face was burned from the cockpit fire. He found RAF Manston, a forward operating base on the English coast used for emergency landings, lined up on the grass beside the runway, cut the engine and bellied the Thunderbolt in without gear. The P-47 slid across the grass for 200 YD, throwing up dirt and grass before grinding to a stop. Ground crew ran to the aircraft. They had to pry Johnson out of the cockpit. His hands were locked on the stick. His legs wouldn't move. The adrenaline was wearing off and shock was setting in. Johnson tried to count the bullet holes in his aircraft. He gave up after 200, and that was just one side of the fuselage. The ground crew found 2120 cannon holes and more than 200 machine gun strikes. Every surface was damaged. The aircraft was a total loss, but it had gotten Johnson home alive. What neither Johnson nor anyone else realized in that moment was that this one incident would become legendary. It would prove something about the P-47 Thunderbolt that changed how American pilots thought about their aircraft. The first pilot Robert Johnson had seen die in combat was Lieutenant Roger Deere. Same day as Johnson's ordeal, June 26, 1943. Same mission, same enemy attack by Fighter Wing 26. The 56th Fighter Group lost 5 aircraft that day. 4 pilots were killed. Roger Deere was one of them, shot down over France. He never made it home. Deere had been in Johnson's training class back in the United States. They trained together at Bridgeport Municipal Airport in Connecticut, starting in July 1942. Those training days had been harrowing for everyone involved. The 56th Fighter Group received the first production P-47B Thunderbolts in June 1942. Nobody had operational experience with The aircraft. The pilots were essentially test pilots and trainers simultaneously. The learning curve at Bridgeport was steep and deadly. The airfield was inadequate for an aircraft the size of the Thunderbolt. The runway was too short, the approaches were difficult. The P-47B model had teething problems that hadn't been resolved. Engines failed, control systems malfunctioned. Pilots made mistakes learning to handle an aircraft unlike anything they'd flown before. Between June and December 1942, the 56th Fighter Group lost 18 pilots killed in training accidents. 41 aircraft were destroyed. Robert Johnson later wrote that many of those accidents were directal. Why attributable to the inadequate facilities at Bridgeport and Stratford? The men weren't dying because they were poor pilots. They were dying because they were learning to fly an experimental fighter at an inadequate airfield under intense pressure to become combat ready as quickly as possible. Roger Dyer survived that training period. He was one of the more naturally gifted pilots. On November 13, 1942, Deere and Lieutenant Harold Comtock pushed their P-47s into near vertical dives from 35,000 ft. Both pilots' controls locked up from compressibility effects as they approached 700 mph. The aircraft began to buffet violently. The sticks were frozen in place. Both pilots thought they were going to die. Comtock kicked the rudder and fought the stick until the aircraft broke out of the compressibility zone and the controls freed up. He pulled out at low altitude, shaking from adrenaline. Deere had the same experience. Both survived. Republic Aviation issued a press release claiming the pilots had exceeded the speed of sound. The story was picked up by newspapers across the country. Some aviation reporters drew it in Ripley's Believe It or Not cartoons. The claim was almost certainly false. The P-47 probably reached around Mach 85 or 0.9, not Mach 1. The compressibility effects were severe, but the sound barrier remained unbroken. General Hap Arnold sent a telegram to the 56th ordering that there would be no more discussion of the dive. The Army Air Force didn't want wild claims about supersonic flight muddying the waters, but the incident showed something important about Dyer. He was willing to push the aircraft to its absolute limits. He was aggressive, fearless, perhaps to a fault. That aggression served him well in training. It got him through the deadly learning period at Bridgeport when so many others died. Now, 7 months later, Deere was dead at 24 years old, shot down in the same battle where Johnson survived. The difference between life and death came down to seconds and luck and the incredible structural toughness of the Thunderbolt. Johnson's aircraft absorbed the punishment and kept flying. Deere's aircraft didn't. Maybe Deere took a cannon hit in the engine that Johnson didn't. Maybe Deere's aircraft was hit in a fuel tank. Maybe the German pilot who got Deere was slightly better positioned or slightly more experienced than the one who attacked Johnson. Combat was random. Survival often came down to factors beyond a pilot's control. Johnson got lucky. Deer didn't by mid-July 1943. The 56th Fighter Group had lost pilots in almost every major mission. The statistics were sobering. Young men arrived in England fresh from training, flew a handful of missions, and died. The aircraft performed well in some situations and struggled in others. The doctrine of hit and run worked against inexperienced German pilots, but failed against veterans who understood how to negate the Thunderbolt's advantages. The problem wasn't simple. The P-47 had real disadvantages that couldn't be ignored. At altitudes below 20,000 ft, where most combat was occurring, the Messmet Bf-109G and Follywolf 190A could outturn the Thunderbolt. They could outclimb it at medium altitudes. They were more responsive in pitch and roll at speeds below 300 mph. In a swirling low-altitude dogfight, the German fighters had significant advantages, but the P-47 also had real advantages that many pilots weren't exploiting. The turbocharged Pratt & Whitney engine maintained power to much higher altitudes than German engines. Above 25,000 ft, the Thunderbolt was faster than anything Germany had. It could dive faster than any German fighter without coming apart structurally. It could survive damage that would destroy a Messmet or Follywolf. It had 850 caliber machine guns versus the German standard of 1 cannon and 2 machine guns, giving it superior firepower in the brief moments when guns were on target. The question was how to fight in ways that emphasized American advantages while minimizing German advantages. That required tactical innovation at the unit level. Pilots and flight leaders experimenting with techniques, sharing what worked, discarding what didn't, learning through experience, which meant learning through casualties. The worst part was the morning ritual. Every day at dawn, pilots walked to the flight line. They performed pre-flight checks on their assigned aircraft. They watched ground crews fuel and arm the P-47s. They listened to briefings about the day's mission. They studied maps showing the route into Germany and back. They looked at intelligence reports about expected German fighter strength. Then they climbed into cockpits and took off toward Germany, knowing some of them wouldn't return. Some came back, some didn't. The randomness was psychologically brutal. The ones who came back often reported that the P-47 felt heavy in hard turns, like there was resistance in the controls, like the P airplane was fighting them when they needed maximum performance. Most pilots thought that was just the nature of a heavy fighter. Big engine, big airframe, big control surfaces. Some resistance was expected. The P-47 weighed nearly twice as much as a Messmet 109. Physics dictated that it couldn't maneuver like a lighter aircraft. But a few experienced pilots started to wonder if the aircraft could be flown more effectively, if there were techniques that could overcome its limitations, if American advantages could be maximized through smarter tactics. Lieutenant Colonel Hubert Zki, commander of the 56th Fighter Group, was one of those pilots who questioned conventional wisdom. ZMI was 30 years old in 1943, older than most fighter pilots. He'd been in the Army Air Corps since 1936. He had more flight experience than almost anyone in the European theater. More importantly, he had combat observation experience. In 1940, before America entered the war, Zenke had been sent to England as an observer with the Royal Air Force during the Battle of Britain. He'd watched British and German fighters duel over southern England. He'd seen tactics evolve in real time. He'd learned that doctrine written in peacetime didn't always survive contact with the enemy. The side that adapted faster usually won. ZMI brought that perspective to the 56th. He didn't just follow the tactical manual. He encouraged his pilots to think, to experiment, to share what they learned. He created an environment where innovation was rewarded rather than punished. Starting in late July, ZMI began gathering his most experienced pilots for debriefing sessions after every major mission. Not just the standard combat report forms, actual discussions. What worked today? What didn't? Why did Lieutenant Smith get a kill while Lieutenant Jones got shot at? What did Smith do differently? Can we teach that technique to everyone? The conversations revealed patterns. The most successful Thunderbolt pilots weren't the ones who strictly followed hit-and-run doctrine. They were the ones who used the doctrine as a starting point but adapted based on circumstances. They started every engagement from altitude. They dove to build speed, but they didn't immediately run after one pass. They used the Thunderbolt's power to stay in the fight longer, making multiple passes from different angles, keeping their speed up, climbing back to altitude between attacks. The less successful pilots, the ones who got shot down or came home without kills, tended to be rigidly following the doctrine, one pass and run, but that gave them limited opportunities to score. And if they got bounced during their escape climb, they were vulnerable because they'd given up their initiative. ZMI synthesized these lessons into guidance for the group. Not rigid rules, but principles. Maintain altitude advantage whenever possible. Use dive speed for the initial attack, but don't be afraid to stay in the fight if you can maintain your energy state. Trust the Thunderbolt's power. Use the engine, keep your speed up. If you lose your speed, you lose your advantage. So disengage and climb back to altitude. It was subtle. The official doctrine didn't change, but the interpretation of that doctrine became more flexible, more adaptive. The results started to show up in the combat reports. On August 10th, 1943, Captain Gerald Johnson was promoted and given command of a flight in the 61st Fighter Squadron. Johnson was an experienced pilot with several kills to his credit already. He was exactly the kind of aggressive thinking pilot that ZMPI wanted, leading formations. Over the next few weeks, Gerald Johnson and other flight leaders started demonstrating what the P-47 could do when flown aggressively. They stayed in fights longer. They used the Thunderbolt's power to reverse situations that should have been hopeless. They climbed when they should have dived. They turned when doctrine said to run. and they started getting kills at a higher rate. By September, the 56th Fighter Group's kill ratio was improving. Noticeably, the group was learning, pilots were surviving longer, experience was accumulating. New tactics were being developed through trial and error in actual combat. On October 4, 1943, the 56th flew its first mission to Frankfurt, Germany, the longest escort mission yet attempted by Thunderbolts. It required careful fuel management and pushed the P-47 to the edge of its combat radius. But the mission succeeded. The bombers hit their targets. The fighters engaged German interceptors. The group came home with multiple kills and acceptable losses. It was proof that the P-47 could do the job it was designed for. Then on October 8, 1943, Robert Johnson scored his 5th confirmed kill. The victim was Oust Hans Philipp, commander of Fighter Wing 1. Philipp had 206 aerial victories, most achieved on the Eastern Front against Soviet aircraft. He was one of Germany's top aces. Johnson's flight encountered Philipp's formation near Hardenberg, and in the end, Etherland, the Germans, were attacking B-17 bombers near Bremen. Johnson dove on the German formation. From altitude, he selected a Faller Wolf and opened fire. The German fighter exploded. Philipp may have been in that explosion, or he may have been hit by defensive fire from the bombers or by other P-47s in the fight. The exact sequence isn't completely clear from records. What is clear is that Philipp bilaid out at extremely low altitude around 50 m, and his parachute failed to fully deploy. He died on impact. Johnson didn't learn until 50 years later that the German pilot he'd killed that day was one of the Luftwaffe's top aces. At the time, it was just another combat mission, another target destroyed, another day of survival, but the symbolism was significant. An experienced German ace flying a supposedly superior turning fighter shot down by an American pilot in a heavy Thunderbolt. It demonstrated that pilot skill and tactics mattered more than raw aircraft performance. By late 1943, something fundamental had shifted in the air war over Europe. American pilots were learning faster than German pilots could adapt. The P-47's weaknesses were being minimized through better tactics. Its strengths were being exploited more effectively. The German perspective on this shift is revealing. Luftwaffe combat reports from October and November 1943 show increasing frustration. German pilots noted that American Thunderbolt pilots were fighting differently than they had in spring and summer. They were staying in engagements longer. They were using vertical maneuvers more effectively. They were harder to shake off once they committed to an attack. Part of the German problem was strategic. By late 1943, the Luftwaffe was being ground down through attrition. They were losing experienced pilots faster than training could replace them. The pilots being shot down were veterans with hundreds of hours of combat experience. The pilots replacing them were often fresh from training with minimal experience. That experience gap showed in combat effectiveness. The Americans had the opposite problem resolved. Their training pipeline in the United States was producing large numbers of adequately trained pilots. These pilots arrived in England, were integrated into experienced squadrons, and learned from veterans before being thrown into the hardest missions. The 56th and other successful groups had developed mentoring systems where new pilots flew as wingmen to experienced flight leaders until they learned the ropes. Additionally, American logistics were superior. When a P-47 was damaged, spare parts were available to repair it. When an engine needed replacement, new engines arrived from the United States within weeks. When a pilot was shot down over friendly territory, he could be returned to his unit within days. The Germans had none of these advantages. By late 1943, the Thunderbolt still couldn't turn with a Focke-Wulf 190 or Messerschmitt 109 in a level turning fight at low altitude. That hadn't changed. The physics of wing loading and power-to-weight ratio hadn't changed. What changed was that American pilots stopped fighting that fight. They refused to fight on German terms. They used altitude. They used dive speed. They used the Thunderbolt's incredible structural strength to pull high-G maneuvers that would tear a German fighter apart. They used the reliable Pratt & Whitney engine to climb back to altitude after every engagement. They used teamwork with wingmen covering each other, making it harder for the German pilots to isolate and kill individual Americans. Most importantly, they learned that the P-47 could take damage and keep fighting. That created a psychological advantage. American pilots knew they could absorb hits and still make it home. Robert Johnson had proven that on June 26, other pilots had similar experiences, getting shot up, but making it home because the Thunderbolt was tough enough to survive. That confidence translated into more aggressive tactics. Pilots were willing to press attacks, willing to stay in fights longer because they trusted their aircraft to survive. German pilots, conversely, were seeing their supposedly superior fighters being shot down by the brutish American Thunderbolts. The psychological impact was real. Confidence eroded, caution increased, and caution in fighter combat often leads to defeat. The breakthrough wasn't a technological advance. The P-47 that dominated the skies in late 1943 was mechanically identical to the P-47 that struggled in April. Same engine, same guns, same airframe. What changed was understanding. American pilots figured out how to fight with the airplane they had, rather than wishing for a different airplane. They accepted the Thunderbolt's limitations and exploited its strengths. They developed tactics that turned a questioned fighter into a legendary war machine. The 56th Fighter Group became the proof of concept. Flying only P-47s throughout the entire war, the Group Beck named the highest scoring fighter group in the 8th Air Force. The official Air Force Historical Research Agency credits the 56th with 665.5 confirmed aerial victories. Some sources cite higher Numbers, including aircraft destroyed on the ground, but the aerial victory total alone is remarkable. 17 pilots from the 56th became aces, 3 became double aces. Colonel Francis Gabreski scored 28, kills flying Thunderbolts. Robert Johnson scored 27. Major David Schilling scored 22 and A2, all achieved in the supposedly inferior P-47, the aircraft that pilots had initially called the Jug, sometimes as a derogatory nickname comparing it to a milk jug, became a source of pride. Thunderbolt pilots loved their aircraft. They trusted it. They knew it would bring them home even when shot full of holes. Johnson's survival on June 26 was proof of that. The numbers support the pilots' faith in their aircraft. Of the 15,683 P-47s built during the war, 5,222 were lost to all causes, including combat and accidents. That includes 1,723 losses to non-combat accidents, which was actually a lower accident rate than many other fighter types. The combat loss rate per mission was 7%, among the lowest of any American fighter in any theater. The P-47's aerial kilt loss ratio was 4.61, better than the more famous P-51 Mustang. In many calculations, better than the P-38 Lightning. By the numbers, the Thunderbolt was arguably the most successful American fighter aircraft of World War II, but it never received the fame of the Mustang. The P-51 was sleek and beautiful. It looked fast-standing. Still, it had elegant lines and a liquid-cooled engine that appealed to aesthetics. The P-47 looked like a flying milk jug. It was big and brutish and not particularly elegant. The massive radial engine gave it a blunt nose. The thick wings and heavy fuselage made it look slow even when it was fast. The public loved the Mustang. Historians wrote about the Mustang after the war when people thought about American fighters in Europe. They thought about P-51s escorting bombers to Berlin. The Thunderbolt pilots didn't care about fame. They knew what their aircraft had done. They knew it had kept them alive when nothing else could have. That mattered more than public perception or historical recognition. Robert Johnson survived the war. He flew 91 combat missions between April 1943 and May 1944. He scored 27 confirmed aerial victories. He returned to the United States in June 1944. He was promoted to major, then lieutenant colonel. He received the Distinguished Service Cross, the nation's second highest award for valor. He received the Silver Star, the Distinguished Flying Cross, Air Medals, a Purple Heart for his wounds. On June 26, he went back to Oklahoma, married his high school sweetheart Barbara, had 4 children, worked as a flight instructor for 2 years after the war, then left aviation entirely, spent the rest of his career in the insurance business. He lived quietly. He didn't seek publicity. He didn't spend his life talking about the war, but he never forgot June 26, 1943, the day his P-47 Thunderbolt took 21 cannon hits and more than 200 machine gun strikes, and kept flying. The day he should have died but didn't. For years, Johnson believed the German pilot who shot him was Lieutenant Colonel Egon Meyer, one of the Luftwaffe's top aces. The story became part of the legend. Some accounts even claimed Johnson called Meyer's family after the war to express respect for their father's skill and honor. But modern historical research suggests the Egon Meyer attribution is probably incorrect. German combat records show no victory claim filed by Meyer on June 26. His unit was based in a different location. He was actually between commands that day, having just relinquished control of one group and not yet officially assuming command of another. The attack on Johnson was carried out by the 2nd Group of Fighter Wing 26, not Meyer's unit. The truth is that the identity of the German pilot who shot Johnson remains unknown. Aviation historians have searched German archives and found no definitive answer. The pilot who showed Johnson such professional respect, who rocked his wings in salute before departing, remains anonymous. What matters is not the German pilot's name, but what the incident demonstrated. The P-47 Thunderbolt could survive damage that would destroy any other fighter. That wasn't marketing. That wasn't propaganda. That was proven fact, documented in photographs of Johnson's battered aircraft and confirmed by Johnson's own survival. Egon Meyer did achieve remarkable success as a fighter pilot. He scored 102 aerial victories, the first Luftwaffe pilot to achieve 100 kills entirely on the Western Front fighting against American and British aircraft. He was killed in action on March 2, 1944. Shot down near Montmedy, France, possibly by Lieutenant Walter Gresham of the 158th Fighter Squadron flying a P-47 Thunderbolt. Meyer was 26 years old. Lieutenant Colonel Hubert ZMPI, who commanded the 56th Fighter Group and developed many of the tactics that made the Thunderbolt effective, survived the war. He flew 166 combat missions. He scored 17 and 3-4 confirmed aerial victories. He was shot down on October 30th, 1944. Not by enemy fire, but by weather. ZMI flew into a severe thunderstorm and his aircraft broke apart. He bilayed out and became a prisoner of war. He spent the final months of the war at Stalag Luftwaffe. After the war, Zenke stayed in the Air Force. He flew jets in Korea. He commanded fighter wings. He retired as a colonel in 1966. He spent his retirement years speaking at military history events, writing articles, giving interviews. He always made sure people understood the truth about the P-47 Thunderbolt. ZMI emphasized the same point in every speech and interview. The P-47 wasn't underrated because people didn't know about it. It was underrated because people didn't understand what made it special. They looked at the Thunderbolt and saw a big, heavy, ungainly fighter that couldn't dogfight with German aircraft. What they missed was that the P-47 didn't need to dogfight. It was designed to dominate through power, not agility. It could climb higher than anything Germany produced. It could dive faster. It could hit harder with 850 caliber machine guns. It could absorb battle damage that would destroy any other fighter. And it could do all of that while carrying up to 2,500 pounds of bombs for ground attack missions. The P-47 Thunderbolt was the ultimate power fighter. It redefined what a fighter aircraft could be. It proved that raw power and structural strength could overcome limitations in maneuverability. It changed air combat, a doctrine for a generation. Jets would eventually make the debate moot. But in the propeller era, the Thunderbolt demonstrated that there was more than one way to dominate the sky. The Thunderbolt's success wasn't limited to air-to-air combat. By mid-1944, as P-51 Mustangs took over most long-range bomber escort duties due to their superior range, P-47s transitioned increasingly to ground attack missions. And in that role, the Thunderbolt was absolutely devastating. The same attributes that made the P-47 survivable in air combat made it ideal for ground attack. The air-cooled radial engine could take multiple hits and keep running. There was no vulnerable liquid cooling system to rupture. The rugged airframe could absorb ground fire that would destroy lighter aircraft. The 850 caliber machine guns were devastating against soft targets like trucks, trains, and troops. And the Thunderbolt could carry up to 2,500 lb of bombs, or 10.5 in high-velocity aerial rockets. Under its wings, from D-Day on June 6, 1944, through the end of the war in Europe on May 8, 1945, P-47 Thunderbolts flew ground attack missions across France, Belgium, the Netherlands, and Germany. They destroyed thousands of German vehicles, hundreds of locomotives, countless trucks and staff cars. They attacked German troops in the open, German fortifications, German supply dumps, German airfields. The statistics are staggering. In the 11 months from D-Day to VE Day, P-47s destroyed or damaged 9,000 German locomotives, 86,000 railroad cars, 68,000 trucks, over 6,000 armored vehicles, and thousands of other targets. These weren't just claims. These were confirmed destructions, verified by gun camera footage and reconnaissance photographs. The impact on German logistics was crippling. The German army depended on rail transport to move supplies and reinforcements. P-47 attacks on the rail network made daytime rail transport suicidal. The Germans had to move trains at night, which drastically reduced their logistical capacity. Truck convoys couldn't move during the day without being attacked. German units at the front were often short of ammunition, fuel, and food because P-47s had destroyed the supply columns trying to reach them. German soldiers on the ground feared the Thunderbolt more than almost any other weapon. They called them Jabos, short for jagged bombers, fighter bombers. When Jabos appeared, German troops dove for cover. The 850 calibers could shred a truck or a column of infantry in seconds. The bombs end. Rockets could destroy bunkers and fortified positions, and there was no effective defense except hiding until the attack was over. The cost was high. Ground attack was the most dangerous mission in the air war, flying low and slow to attack ground targets exposed aircraft to intense anti-aircraft fire. Many Thunderbolt pilots were shot down by German flak while strafing trains or truck convoys. But the Thunderbolt's ruggedness helped. Pilots brought home aircraft with dozens of flag holes, with cylinders shot off engines with control. Surfaces partially destroyed. Other fighters wouldn't have made it. The Thunderbolt could. The ground attack mission became the Thunderbolt's defining role in the final year of the war, while Mustangs escort D-bombers to Berlin. Thunderbolts ranged across occupied Europe, destroying everything German that moved. It wasn't as glamorous as air combat against enemy fighters. It didn't produce aces, but it won the war. Germany couldn't fight effectively when their logistics were being destroyed faster than they could rebuild. In 1998, Robert Johnson died at age 78. He was buried in River Hill Cemetery, now part of Lake Y in South Carolina. His obituary mentioned his service as a fighter pilot in World War II. It mentioned his 27 kills. It mentioned the Distinguished Service Cross. It did not mention June 26, 1943. It did not mention the 200 bullet holes. It did not mention that he'd proven the P-47 Thunderbolt could take punishment that would destroy any other aircraft and still fly home. At the National Museum of the United States Air Force in Dayton, Ohio, there's a P-47 Thunderbolt on display. It's a D model, serial number 4549167, nicknamed 5X5. It's painted to represent the aircraft flown by Colonel Joseph Laughlin, commander of the 362nd Fighter Group. The actual aircraft was built in 1945 at Republic's plant in Indiana and served primarily as a trainer. It was later transferred to the museum and restored by Republic Aviation for the 20th anniversary of the Thunderbolt's first flight. The placard next to the Friends aircraft tells visitors it was one of the most produced American fighters of World War II. 15,683 were built. The aircraft had 850 caliber machine guns and could carry 2,500 lb of bombs. P-47s destroyed more than 7,000 enemy aircraft during the war, more than half in air-to-air combat. What the placard doesn't fully convey is why the Thunderbolt succeeded. It wasn't because of superior design or advanced technology. German fighters were more advanced in many ways. The Faller Wolf 190D and Messid 109G were arguably better aircraft on paper. The Thunderbolt succeeded because American pilots learned to fight with the airplane they had. They accepted its limitations. They exploited its strengths. They developed tactics that negated enemy advantages. They stayed aggressive. They stayed confident. They trusted their aircraft to bring them home. That's how innovation actually happens in war, not through engineering, breakthroughs, or technological superiority, though those help, but through pilots and commanders who see what they have, understand its capabilities, and figure out how to use it better than the enemy expects. Through mechanics who kept the engines running, and the guns firing through training that produced skilled pilots, faster than the enemy could replace their losses. The P-47 Thunderbolt was never the most agile fighter. It was never the fastest fighter at low altitude. It was never the best-looking fighter, but it was one of the most effective American fighters of World War II. Not because it was perfect, but because the people who flew it and maintained it made it work. The men of the 56th Fighter Group proved that. Robert Johnson proved that on June 26, 1943, when he brought home an aircraft that had no business still flying. Hubsky proved that through 3 years of combat leadership that turned tactical theory into battlefield practice. Francis Gabreski proved that with 28 kills and the ability to push the Thunderbolt to its limits and survive. Hundreds of other pilots proved it every day by climbing into their Thunderbolts and flying into combat over hostile territory. They flew the Jug. They trusted the Jug. They came home in the Jug, and that's why the P-47 Thunderbolt, despite never achieving the fame of the Mustang, deserves to be remembered as one of the great fighter aircraft of World War II. Not the most famous, but perhaps the most faithful. It brought its pilots home. The P-47's legacy extended beyond World War II. After the war, many countries purchased surplus Thunderbolts. The aircraft served with air forces in Peru, Brazil, Chile, Bolivia, Colombia, Ecuador, Venezuela, China, Iran, Turkey, Portugal, France, and Yugoslavia. Some remained in service into the 1950s and even early 60s in South American air forces. The ruggedness and reliability that made it effective in World War II made it valuable for smaller nations that couldn't afford newer jet fighters. In the United States, the P-47's design influenced post-war aircraft development. Republic Aviation, the company that built the Thunderbolt, went on to design the F-84 Thunderjet, one of the first successful American jet fighters. The F-84 inherited the Thunderbolt's philosophy: big, rugged, heavily armed, emphasizing survivability and firepower over pure maneuverability. That design philosophy continued through the F-1005 Thunder Chief in the 1960s. The lesson of the Thunderbolt was that there's more than one way to design a successful fighter. You don't have to build the lightest, most maneuverable aircraft. You can build a big, powerful, tough aircraft and make it work through proper tactics and pilot training. That lesson has been relearned multiple times in aviation history. The F-4 Phantom in Vietnam, the F-15 Eagle, the A-10 Warthog, all followed the Thunderbolt's philosophy in different ways. The Thunderbolt also taught the importance of pilot training and tactical development. The aircraft that struggled in April 1943 was mechanically identical to the aircraft that dominated in December 1943. The difference was pilot skill and tactics. That lesson applies beyond aviation. The best equipment in the world is useless without people who know how to use it effectively. Training matters, experience matters, leadership matters. The 56th Fighter Group succeeded not just because they had good aircraft, but because they had leaders like Hubsky who fostered innovation and learning. If you found this story compelling, please like this video. It helps us share more forgotten stories from World War II. Subscribe to stay connected with these untold histories. Each one matters. Each one deserves to be remembered. Leave a comment below telling us where you're watching from. Our community spans the globe from Texas to Tasmania. From veterans to history enthusiasts, you're part of something special here. Thank you for watching, and thank you for keeping these stories